including peaceful transitions, including that candidates show their tax forms. We no candidate has dared not ever do that before. So maybe we do have to try to figure out where the holes are and patch them up with rules
Yeah.
so that this doesn't happen again.
Do you get a sense, Dana, that there's an actual appetite in Congress to do the kind of heavy lifting around, a candidate has to disclose their tax returns. A candidate has to divest themselves of their financial interests. Are these just words we toss around, or do you think there's actually an appetite for this kind of reform?
Well, in the House, yes. In the Senate, no. And, so that's why Georgia becomes so incredibly important. I think you're going to see every reporter, every outlet Georgia is being flooded right now with people from outside who are coming in to participate, who are coming in to record the participation. It's got to be just quite a scene, and it's fun to see Georgia get so much attention versus always Ohio or Iowa. Sorry. Um,
All
so
the money flowing into Georgia right now for these.
money flowing into it. But in our little part of the world where I live on our farm, we saw that money didn't really matter because it's a very red county when it comes to local officials, and that we had some huge races just for a state legislative seat, and the Democrat poured just, I don't know, he had 100 times more money than the Republican, but the Republican was a Trump loyalist, and he won just hands down.
Right.
So, especially in local races, money can only go so far. I think that's one of the interesting things that I've learned, because we all, sort of always assume the more money you have, the more
Right.
you'll be likely to win.
But the money part is so huge. I mean,
It's
for
so
Senator Perdue, we know that he's done all kinds of stuff around stock trades related to his insider information.
yeah.
And then secondly, when we learn the full truth of what Russia's connection to Trump is, especially with loans and a lot of the inflated,
Mm.
condo sales that happened in 2008 and so on, I would certainly hope that that would give lawmakers reason to say, you know what, you want to be president? That's fantastic. We have to know all about your finances so
Yeah.
that you are not a national security threat.
Yeah. Well, that whole issue of national security threats has also been something that um, has really been unusual this time around. Both parties, but in particular the Republicans, have used that to do many things. That are some wise, some aren't wise over the years. But everything has to be driven by national security, and yet this time around, the national security stakes were obviously very high. The intelligence community that Republicans had been loyalists to for so long, all of that just fell by the wayside. And that to me was remarkable, to what extent it just didn't matter to any of them.
That's right.
Because I think those things really are threats. And I'm a minimalist when it comes to, what is actually a threat to the
Right.
United States.
The one subpoena I'm dying to see issued, and I'm not holding my breath either,
Okay.
but we know in Helsinki there was an American translator in the room, and I know she's a she, and I know that she was probably intimidated and cowed and whatever. But
Yeah.
boy, I wonder if that subpoena is coming to help us understand why in the world, as Susan told us last night, Trump himself would have asked for a one-on-one meeting with nobody. I mean, it's that alone should not be that
Yeah.
should not be allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be very interesting to see how the court would rule on that, because I'm sure he would challenge it. But yeah, I think that's a great subpoena to hope for.
So, folks, ask your questions in the Q&A box if you can. Some of you have put it into the chat, but there's a question here from Melanie Owen about the Me Too movement and whether Trump, helped spur the Me Too movement, or I don't know. And I guess that gets into other subpoenas or other, legal cases that I know he has against him right now related to his
Right.
egregious behavior in the
No, I
past.
definitely think it did because it came just as the Me Too movement, or at the same time that the Me Too movement was really taking off. It didn't ultimately matter during the elections, but the things that happened during the election, the tape from um, The Apprentice and uh, Access Hollywood, whatever that was, that was just huge. And then you do have that lawsuit that's pending over him, and it keeps going forward. That is the interesting thing, is that the court said no, you were not president then, and so it will go forward. And I think that that is for sure one case that is going to continue. Don't see how he's going to get out of that. So yes, I think it did, and it also exposed. Um, I just I just keep thinking about how he responded to some of the rape and harassment allegations by saying, "Oh, she's not my type." Just
Horrendous.
so I don't know about you, but every time that happened, I would have another another conversation in the household and among colleagues, and um, you'd hope that would trickle around. So
Right.
I do, yeah, big,
We know that a lot's going to happen in the next 50 days. We know all the news about whether Trump's looking at a potential self pardon or pardon for his children. I would certainly expect Rudy Giuliani would need one, especially for what he did in Ukraine, getting paid by Ukrainian interests to get rid of the
mm.
ambassador, and just some ugly stuff there.
But you remember what Woodward said about that? He said a pardon, to accept a pardon, infers, or he used a stronger word than that, that guilt.
That's right.
I don't know. In the Trump world, I'm not sure that would matter,
Right.
but we don't really know if those would be considered legal. The, the scholars I've listened to, they just keep saying this is an open question. So
It
don't really.
seems like the right thing for the Biden administration to do, and I know there's a lot of disagreement on this, but I think the classy thing for him to do would be to issue that kind of pardon for any crimes he may or may not have committed in office, but then for
Hmm.
the DOJ to encourage state investigations to continue, and that kind of takes the political heat off, or the whiffs of partisanship off at the federal level, but really leaves it to New York State and elsewhere to do what they do. And I mean, there's so many potential cases to look at, but certainly the operations of the Trump organization and
Yeah,
all the
which we know now as of yesterday that Ivanka had a 5-hour interview uh, with the DC Attorney General, who, by the way, when she started making her case on Twitter, he started going after that on Twitter, which was pretty amazing.
right.
Beware Twitter. Too
I
late
mean,
now.
because in some ways we have to move past this Trump dominance of the media landscape, and it. I don't want to say them. Well,
I think that's going to be hard,
yeah,
honestly. I honestly think the newspapers, I know they've got to be thinking about this now, and I haven't talked to our leadership about it, but it is going to be a big dive in readerships and clicks, and I can see, for economic reasons, everybody trying to keep that up.
right.
So I'm hoping the public will really be vigilant, really start to ding the media if they do bad things, because I don't really know how else to react to something like that.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think his megaphone will continue no matter what into the future. But I mean, I hope it can sort of slip into the realm of entertainment as opposed to being more in the realm of
Yeah.
politics. And certainly the scuttlebutt I've read about Ivanka Trump considering a run in 2024. I mean, it would be nice if we could move on by there just being some sort of collective understanding that we need to move on, and that maybe
Hmm.
a little discrediting in the courts might help to just close this chapter.
Yeah. Keep wishing.
Well, let's move on from Trump then.
Okay.
Let me take a couple of these questions. um, and we'll switch gears here from Trump. So, bye, President Trump. Thank you so much, and best of luck. And we're going to talk about
Let's sign off now.
we're going to talk about some other things. So, Linda Barker writes, one of the talks that amazed me the most in the conference was the digital forensics talk from Malachi Brown. The very same day the news had a report on police shootings in Nigeria using the very same techniques. And
Hmm.
also, I'm so awed and taken by the dedication and courage of all the journalists to get us the truth. So important. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. As I've said many times, I'm such a huge fan of the digital forensics world. I think it, aside from all the techniques that they use to get what they get, they create images, they create things that we can see and things that are animated. And I just think that in 2020 is such a more effective way, or a newly effective way at delivering us some of these really complicated issues.
And it's really a revolution in technology that came very swiftly and that came as a result of the wars on around the world as after 9/11, because that sort of imagery that is available now commercially was developed for that. The combined with not just social media but how you comb through social media, that's part of that as well. So really, it's a byproduct of war, all that technology.
Right.
And it's great that people like Malcolm, but also the very first people that started that were in Britain, were the
Bellingcat.
what's the name again? Hmm?
Was it Bellingcat that
Yeah,
started?
Bellingcat.
Yeah.
And it was and they first did it in Ukraine, and everybody loved it. And the fact that now the mainstream media is using it, we did a really great one on the young man who killed one person, I believe, at one of the, I think in Oklahoma, piecing together video and photography and social media images to break down, where he was exactly, what happened exactly. And you're right. It's an amazing capability, and I think it in this day and age, we hope it shows people an objective truth, even though images can be
Right.
manipulated as well. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. And it's spreading. It's definitely spreading.
And it opens the possibility too that we can start tracking things that we haven't ever been able to. And one of the questions during Malachi's session was from Ambassador Vicky Huddleston. Vicky, I don't know if you're on, but hi,
Yeah.
you are. And she was just saying, can we use this technology to start documenting what's happening with, Chinese and Japanese and Spanish, fishing vessels, and really,
Oh,
pin down
well,
the kinds of things they're doing, or animal poaching in Africa, and using this kind of technology to just get to shed some light in areas that have been
yeah.
dark for so long.
It's absolutely possible. And I'm thinking of the New York Times' amazing work on the Uyghurs, where they documented how dozens of temples, no, they're Muslim, so of
Oh,
mosques, dozens of mosques were blown up. And they did it by using before and after satellite imagery. So,
yeah.
yeah, I think we can. It's just a magic. It's just a question of our imagination and what we want to spend all that time on.
Yeah. And I've seen a few different presentations by the digital forensics folks, and the other thing I love about it is it's a young field, and they're young journalists, and they're
Yeah,
using,
exactly.
they use their computers in these amazing ways to just kind of track and geolocate, and diving into tweets and getting all the
Yeah.
information that none of us really pay attention to determine exact timing of events and places of events. I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, and is when I started teaching, my thought was that those people that can do that, if they learn then also a little bit about cultivating sources, a little bit of Bob's technique and a little bit of the old fashioned gumshoe, appear on people's doorsteps, be able to talk to human beings. If they can learn a little bit of that, which I try to concentrate on teaching, it is going to be the best generation of journalists. We have to worry about the business model, but I really think there's great hope for journalism in that way.
I do too. So there's a question here from Rich Moriarty, and Rich and I were having some back and forth on email this morning.
I
And
really
and Rich is on our program committee. And let me just add as well, one of the amazing things about Santa Fe is there's so many super smart people that are
yeah.
thinking about things, and and I'm the great benefactor of getting all kinds of comments and questions and so on from you all out there, and it's amazing. So Rich, who's a great representative of what I've just said, he and I were talking about Bob's response last night when I asked him the question, you've taken heat for not disclosing what you learned in
You didn't turn
February.
red. I was very proud of you that you didn't turn red. Your face was like,
Well, it's not often the most, famous journalist in the world cuts you down and starts dropping F bombs, but at the same time, it's always
rite
entertaining.
of passage.
But his, but his question, and I think it's a really good question, is when should reporters consider holding off on disclosing explosive information to maximize effect? And obviously, there's a lot of detail and nuance and context that would always inform the answer to that. But Dan, if you learned something, incredible about, for example, a Mexican drug cartel, what would you do with that, given that, your story or your book isn't going to be published for another number of months?
Well, you really have to weigh whether the impact of a tiny piece of a story, no matter how explosive it is really going to do what you want it to do or what you think it deserves. I'll give you a personal example. When I was reporting the story about the terrible conditions at Walter Reed Army Medical Center for veterans returning from the war, or not even veterans, active duty. We got criticized later by one or two Army officers who said, "Why didn't you tell us this earlier?" Well, first of all, it wasn't a book, but it took 4 months. So that's not that long. But also, it would not have had the impact. The Army, in that case, would have fought back. They would have said, well, you don't have that much evidence. And so I think you have to weigh that. I do think that Woodward is correct in the sense that he didn't even know himself what he was hearing. He didn't know about the meeting yet. And he's also correct that would that have mattered one more story about, well, he really knows. Well, he knew what we were knowing.
Well, and I saw his
It's not
answer.
especially brief to him.
Right. I saw his 60 Minutes interview where his final phone conversation with Trump was happening as the book was going to press, or had been finished and was getting printed up. And and Woodward told the president, "The book's a tough book, Mr. President, and I don't know if you're going to really like it." And then Bob said, an hour and a half after that conversation, Trump tweeted, "There's a book coming out from Bob Woodward, and it's fake." And and so it's like, he could have said Bob could have said whatever he wanted in
Right.
February, and it would have been, spun out by Fox and by Trump as being, erroneous, despite the fact that it was recorded with his voice. But, there's in that
Yeah.
situation, there probably wasn't a lot realistically that he could have done.
And really, this day and age in particular, the news moves so quickly that you even, how many times have we seen amazing stories on the front page and they're not even there, several hours later because something's been updated, something else has come along, and it really, the velocity of news is is something that we can't even react to. It's too quickly, and the institutions for sure can't react to them, and they don't react because there's so much of it from so many other outlets. It used to be that the big newspapers, among them, the Post, we would look for a reaction from Congress to see whether they were going to do something about the thing we discovered. Well, that's rare now because you have so many outlets. You have 2 dozen revelations a day, just about.
Right.
So it's easy for everyone to just ignore it, and that's another reason. I think it's. I think he is right in holding some of that.
Well, and it's hard to dispute holding it until the heat of the electoral cycle. And if Bob believes that Trump's the wrong man for the job, then perhaps staging and timing the release of that information
Yeah.
would be.
Well, that's where he has an independence that works for him because it used to be a time, and I don't know if that would have held this time, where the big papers they would not have run something inflammatory too close to the election. And I remember when we had a story that wasn't really done until about 12 days before George Bush's second term, where we had actually documented that he had had an affair, I don't know, 20 years earlier. And they decided not to run it because it was so close to the election. They didn't want to have an outsized impact. So that's how far we've come. I don't think that would be the case now. I think anything goes.
If
I think,
only a certain FBI director had been aware of that before the 2016 election. That one still boggles the mind that he decided to do what he did. Let's talk about Fox News a little bit. I have a couple questions here. Um,
hmm,
One from Brian Gobeck. Any possibility of getting back to factual news versus opinion slash entertainment, or are we locked into the Fox model going forward? And let me just tag onto that Sheila Hewitt's question. Going forward, do you see any controls or monitoring of the contents or facts presented by Fox News and similar news outlets? What might that look like?
yeah, definitely no on the monitoring or regulation or anything like that. I think Fox News is going to have. There was a time before Obama where I think it was under Clinton where they moved a little bit more to the center because they wanted to have Clinton people on the show. I don't think we're in that period anymore. I don't think they're going to be moving to the middle any less or any more under Biden in order to get Biden folks. I think they're probably going to move further to the right, I guess if you call it the right, the in order to appeal to those people who are mad at them and
Right.
maybe they'll do something to get them back, which is a frightening thought because it really does mean you have to go even further into conspiracy theories. So on social media, though, which unfortunately still matters, I think I read today that Twitter, I think it's Twitter, has decided they are not going to allow retweets or tweets
Right.
of anti-vaccination fake news, hoaxes, that sort of thing.
Right.
That's a big step, and I'm sure they're going to get a lot of heat for it. I would argue that's a good step. But we don't want to give the social media companies too much control over censoring.
Right.
That's why, again, I think you go back to the regulations that they have in Europe as a model for what we could look at here. And we need to seriously look at things.
Yeah. I like Elizabeth Warren's sense that, social media are utilities now. They're not platforms.
Yeah.
They're not, news organizations. They're utilities, and therefore they have to be regulated in order to, prevent the flow of bad information. And even, and it was interesting to see what Twitter did around the New York Post story talking about Hunter Biden's recovered laptop and all the salacious emails
Yeah.
or whatever that, and it was dubious reporting at best. And, and I think it was pushed forward for absolute political reasons. And Twitter decided, and again, this is social media making its own corporate decisions, but they decided they were not going to allow that story to be
Mhm.
posted on Twitter, which was great until a couple of days later when they buckled under the pressure put on them by all kinds of folks and said, okay, we'll allow the tweets anyway. So,
Yeah. It's not a position they want to be in, but there has to be. I mean, the fundamental question about them is much more deep. It's about the algorithm, it's about the model of attracting you and then manipulating you in a way that you don't understand or that you can't even be aware of. And so someone needs to take that on as well. And again, I think it's coming, but I don't know if it's going to come that quickly.
there's a fascinating podcast that I listened to a while ago called The Rabbit Hole. And it
Hmm.
basically charts one young man's journey into YouTube for an entire year, whereby he just lets YouTube keep playing whatever videos it's suggested,
Mhm,
going down
mhm.
their rabbit hole, their algorithmic
Wow.
rabbit hole. And gradually it brought him into the big, bright, horrible world of conspiracy theories and like hyper right wing, non factual arguments for, making sense of the world. Scary
Yeah.
stuff.
It's happening. It happens every single, moment you do anything on your social media.
Right.
Yeah.
Couple more questions here. Okay, great. Here's a question on social media as well. It's from Amy Marish. Hey, Amy. She
Hi,
says,
Amy.
"Hey, hi,
I
Dana."
love your art. I see it when Dave sends me his column. I
Awesome.
love it.
Dave's. I
Yeah,
love that man's moderating. His voice just.
I
I love
know.
it. So Amy says, Dana, can you elaborate a little bit on European social media regulations? And do we I know I only know a few things about those regulations, like, they allow you to be forgotten forever by search engines.
Hmm.
Not sure is
Well,
capable.
they also demand that they be more active on content moderation, which is a way of saying censorship, and making sure that things that aren't fake, things that are fake, don't get out there, and that are of harm to national security and that sort of thing. But they also don't allow bots and that push things out and make them feel like they're or make them trend even though there's really not a human behind it. And they had to really get tough with the companies because in the beginning the companies were saying, well, we can't do that. And then they said, well, then we're going to shut you down, we're going to penalize you with a lot of money every day. And lo and behold, they figured out how to do it. So I do think it's a question of pushing these companies up against the wall and saying, then we're going to close you down.
Yep.
And in Europe, I think there is more of a tradition of censorship. In Germany, where you can't talk about Nazis, that wouldn't fly here. But they have also been willing to really play hardball with the companies, and I think that's what it's going to take here. And you have to have the confidence to do that. And you have then, in order to have the confidence, you really have to understand the terrible thing that it creates when you allow the algorithm, like you said, with the rabbit hole example. Terrible things happen if you just leave it alone.
Sure.
Terrible things. And remember, I was involved that with the Frontline movie, the two-part documentary called The Facebook Dilemma, where I learned all about this. And one of our researchers did the same thing as your rabbit hole guy, and within a week she was getting Nazi American Nazi propaganda. And it was only because she had purposely answered and interacted with not a Nazi group, but a you know a right leaning group, and then kept interacting with the stuff that was given to her by the algorithm. So it's so much more dangerous than I think we all use it for. That didn't. Anyway, you get what I mean.
Well, and also some of the things that are so troubling are when, Zuckerberg goes to Congress for
Yeah.
these hearings and listening to that guy speak, and it's so hard to stomach the kinds of things and how he just divests himself of responsibility.
Right.
But even worse is listening to
Yeah.
senators ask horrendously bad
Yeah.
questions. They're like starstruck by this guy and talking all about how, their granddaughter,
Yeah.
does this or that on Facebook. And it's like, can we get real about this and ask
Yeah.
real questions? I might
Well, I think that as they get younger, the members, they're going to have a better understanding. So hopefully, that's going to go away soon too. But I do think it takes consumers to be on the case of Facebook and their members. Yeah.
agree. Well,
Now,
let's
I want somebody to sue them. I don't know. Every time I meet a lawyer that's involved in social media, I say, can't you sue for breach of their own rules? Because it is. They breach their own rules all the time in allowing this stuff on their platform.
right. We'll see. But I think you're right. Hearing AOC talk about social media is a very different experience than listening to,
Mm.
Senator Lindsey Graham talk about it. And I certainly hope that just that savvy, not
Right.
necessarily the political side of what AOC brings, but just the savvy of
Yeah.
understanding the fullness of what this phenomenon is. Let's switch gears. I want to ask you, you've got a big piece coming out on Sunday. You want to tell us about
Yes,
it?
I do, and it's related to our topic. That's why I have these bags under my eyes because I've been editing with my editors, various editors. I've been working on this. project about the intersection of Mexican cartels and corrupt Mexican officials and the murder of Mexican journalists, which is Mexico is now the most dangerous place to be a journalist. And we concentrate on the state in Mexico, Veracruz, that is the most dangerous state to be a journalist in Mexico. And we profile one person who was killed in 2012, and we follow. We try to pick up where she left off. This is a collaboration. This is the really fun thing. It's a collaboration with a group of reporters from Mexico and Europe that came together under the banner of an organization called ForbiddenStories.org. And their mission is to continue the work of journalists who've been murdered to stop their work. So this is the third project that they've done, and it's been an amazing experience because it's so international. So you're trying to translate documents, but also not everybody out there speaks English, and my Spanish has come back a little bit more. But also to and so we're all feeding each other our initial tips and interviews, and just develop from there. I think more and more collaboration like this is going to happen. You saw it in the Panama Papers and all the big data links, and it's great to see. Mainly because money laundering is and other forms of international corruption have no boundaries, and they must be investigated this way. So, and they're so important to investigate because unfortunately, places like Mexico, the leadership there over and over again just steals the countrymen blind and takes their money, and in this case goes to Spain with it. So it's a it's a it's a 5-part series. I'm only working on one part, and it comes out on noon Eastern time on Sunday is when the first story appears. And there were times, I'll just tell you one story about it. There were times when I really felt, working on drug cartels, that I was back in a world that made sense, as bad as that sounds. That the world today that we're in is so upside down, with fake news and hoaxes and a president who promotes it. The world of crime and cartels and corruption, you sort of can understand how that works, and understand how what motivates people, and understand how to catch the bad guys and how law enforcement catches it. And so it was oddly some mental relief to go back into a world that you could make sense of, rather than the one we're in, where I'm when I think about all the times we've referred to Fox News or the president's fake news moniker, you just do have to say, how is that going to end? Where does this go from here? And I come back to the question of education, which is such a long-term
Yep.
solution, and not yet one that this country has really done a good job on.
Nope. Let
So
me
anyway, it's called the Cartel Project. The group is called Forbidden Stories, and in the at the Post and elsewhere around the world, it'll be running on noon on Sunday. The first story.
so two follow-ups on that. One is, at what point are we really going to put the lens onto the international banking industry and how much that industry facilitates
Yeah.
corruption, drug trade, all kinds of dirtiness? When is that reckoning coming? Do you think it's coming? What kind of a role do you think, they do play right now?
I think that journalism is slowly getting there. Unfortunately, it is virtually impossible for a journalist to make inroads without cooperation from law enforcement, because we don't have tools to look inside. And this, it's so hard. So you have to rely on leaks, or on very rare cooperation, because law enforcement doesn't want to give away their cases. But the Panama Papers and other things have really shown that it is possible, and that it's so important. And there are countries that are tightening up on that, but I do think that should be a priority among reporting. And it's, yeah, it's a tough one. I myself would like to, since I can't even really read a balance sheet, I myself would like to take take some classes. And I have some. There are a couple institutions that I know of that are trying to teach journalists how to follow money internationally and that sort of thing. So, I think there could be ways to teach yourself how to do a better job at that. But it is so important. Yeah.
So the second follow-up is really around collaborative journalism. Another question here from Rich, which is a great one, given that we did talk about collaborative journalism in a few different sessions. So he writes, the session on collaborative journalism was fascinating, particularly given the inherently competitive nature of journalism. We
Right.
all recognize the threats to local news outlets. Are there opportunities for national news outlets to work collaboratively with local outlets in ways that may help those local outlets?
Well, there are some things happening in that regard. Thinking of it's a frontline initiative where they are pairing with a number of local outlets to help them do investigations. And I think they're using some of their resources, and there's a whole process of applying for it. And I think they consider whether you've already started your investigation and what it is likely to yield. So there is some of that happening now. I think the other group that is doing it is ProPublica.
Right.
And oddly, NPR has started doing this much more than within their own family, within the affiliates. A couple of years back, they said, we should bring them in. Before they were sort of competitors, they would lift stuff out of, but now they are using those people in a much more integral way. I think on these big things, I've seen at the Post, for instance, that we have broken down some of those barriers culturally. It used to be when we paired up with a TV outlet, for instance. Like I've done stuff on with 60 Minutes. Oh, it was such a headache, because everyone was so cautious about the
Right.
competitiveness thing. But now, because there's so much demand for new things, new news, the velocity of news demands we keep putting up things. They're much more open to it. And I think because of that, they've learned how to trust one another. In this collaboration, what was good was they only had one outlet from every country. So I didn't have to worry. I think I might have been a little more worried if if the New York Times was part of the group. I probably wouldn't have participated. Um, but because they weren't, I I really found it great to help colleagues and vice versa, and we had a very collaborative group. It's part of it is just a cultural thing. If your management says okay, it's being able to actually get share stuff, and you need to do it in order to get better at it. So I do think it's coming. It is here, but I think it's gonna happen more and more. And I'm gonna be a big advocate of that because, again, the world's shrinking, and you know the money from all these countries, the amount of drug money that is in the United States in real estate holdings. I couldn't even tell you. I don't have any clue what it really is, but I know that in my little slice of the world, you can go to some places along the border in Texas and local officials will say, "Oh yeah," and we found a lot of cases where former corrupt officials were living now in the United States, had homes for their families, just all this. It's overwhelming. So it's
It
still
would be
invisible, but
It'd be amazing to look at the American real estate market in total and understand all the different, shelters that
yes,
bad entities abroad have used to make their money, well, to launder their money essentially and invest their
right.
money in American real estate. It's a real thing.
Yep, definitely.
I've got a couple other questions here, and folks, now is your time to. Yeah, here's one. So, I think we live in a world where things are consolidating and getting bigger. corporations are getting bigger and squeezing out mom and pops. I think the same is true in the media landscape where, the best journalists, flock to the Times or the Post or the Wall Street Journal.
Mhm.
We know of the effects on local journalism for lots of different reasons. Do you think that that's a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing? I mean, are we putting too much of our talent into one bucket by having? I mean, the Post has I don't even know how many journalists on staff, and I mean, and I am a huge fan of the Post for lots of
Yeah.
reasons. But do you think that's are we shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit by having all our talent kind of concentrated in a
Yeah.
couple different?
Well, I do think it's all about the market. It's all about, economics. And hey, we have, Jeff Bezos as our owner. So, we're so lucky in that regard because really before he bought it, we were shedding our assets and our reporters. We were looking at a terrible, terrible moment. I think what's happening in terms of consolidation is the dozens of groups that sprung up with the internet and with social media that were online only. Some of them have found, a decade or so later they can't make it financially, and you've seen them close. So there's that kind of consolidation at the same time that you've seen local news consolidation. But you still have a very healthy group of nonprofits that have come up. ProPublica, I'm thinking of as a great example of that. And I think a lot of community newspapers are now nonprofit, but it's still not likely to save them because even doing that, there's yet to be found a business model. So when we're all talking about, I'm on the board of I spend a lot of time trying to keep this little paper out where we have a farmhouse alive, and it's really hard. And I think some smart business people need to come along and help us because that's what we need. How do you keep this? How do you have a model that just does not always rely on philanthropy?
Yeah,
Because that's so hard to keep up.
tell me about it.
No, yeah. So, and could you? What I would like to see is a way to piggyback. Uh, for instance, in our market, the Post and our little paper. Is there a way that the Post would allow sharing of content to some extent? I mean, we want to keep our content local. Is there a way of sharing technology so that we don't have to kind of recreate the universe so that every paper doesn't have to recreate its own content management system and that sort of thing. So I think there needs to be a wholesale streamlining of community news because it's not tenable as it is. And then a lot of people now, and I'm really happy about this, are talking about uh, taxpayer funded media funds. um, this is how Europe does many of their outlets, and I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, I think we have to look at that. And of course, we would have big, thick walls between the funders
Right.
and the newspaper, but I do think, and it would also highlight the important role of journalism in civic life.
I agree. I mean, growing up with CBC in Canada, which is the
Exactly.
national broadcaster, it's a very different thing. And
Yeah.
I can't defend everything CBC's ever done, but there's the appearance of relative objectivity. They're
Yeah.
not picking a side in the fight, and they're not driven by profits and clickability and so on. They just have the mandate to report on the news as it comes in, and as a consequence, CBC has been for decades the kind of authority in Canadian news. By far not the only one, but
Yeah.
if you're looking for that kind of platform to get relatively unbiased information, I say that with an asterisk, of course, but it's a good source to go to.
Yeah.
I don't know whether NPR can approach that level here, or whether this country is just too big for that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think it's a national security issue in the end. And now we're seeing that in a very stark way with all terrible uh the terrible outlets that are pretending to be news.
Yeah. So, a couple other questions here, and we're going to wrap up shortly. But how do you How do you speak to your students, Dana, about this dizzying world of journalism, about,
Mm.
journalists that are persecuted and murdered for on the one hand, of, this tough dynamic we have right now around the truth, around, even just a lot of the social media harassment that can happen. I mean, becoming a journalist today is absolutely essential, and yet this is not an easy career path. And
Yeah.
how do you advise your very best students about
Well,
what
first I want them to know how bad it is overseas because most people do not know. Why would they?
right?
And that opens their eyes and shows them really the courage of people overseas and makes them, without a doubt, reflect on their own careers and also their own complaints. Okay, that official won't talk to you. That is nothing like what Maria Ressa is confronting. So go bug the hell out of that person. I'm hoping that it makes their problems become minimal problems and insurmountable problems. And you know, harassment online, there are techniques that you can use to minimize that. Safety is an issue now, like it wasn't before. Safety covering protests, because of the many people who don't like the media anymore and think we're the enemy of the people. That is a real issue, and I don't yet think we do a good enough job. But what I say basically is keep your nose down and do your reporting. Because that is really the if you're going to be a good reporter, you have to really like doing that. I'm not interested in really, I'm not interested in working really hard for people who don't want to be really good reporters. And so the ones that have that instinct, I've got to find out, I've got to push through that barrier. That's what I really love to see. And I try to get even the shyest person to understand how you can do that. And then when it gets in your blood, you really have to tune out the rest and go for what you're doing. Go for the obstacle in front of you, and then it becomes addictive.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Clearly.
Yeah,
Well,
after all these years, I should.
and it must be just such a hit when you get some amazing piece of information.
Yeah.
Hearing another Bob Woodward interview when he was talking about an interview he did with George W. and how George W. said he asked George, how do you feel history is going to look at your decision to invade Iraq? And George said, um, history we don't know because we're going to be dead. And that was that was the big moment for Bob because that was the end of the book. Uh, and it must have there must be a real adrenaline hit when you just get something that is just absolutely burningly important.
Yeah, and when you get engulfed in a story like I have been with this cartel story, I mean, I can't. My pheromones have been lighting up when I get these little obscure, what is going to sound like very obscure little facts for an American audience, but I know in Veracruz for the Mexican public, they're not insignificant, and yeah, you still get a boost from that.
What One last question before we'll switch gears into something else. And I've asked you this before, but I want to ask it again. And this comes from Mary Charlotte Demandi, who's a radio, a podcast host, and an amazing interviewer in her own right. And she asks, what about a news certification? We have obviously entertainment in the news field. We have obviously opinion in the news field. Do you think it would ever be possible to say, slap a letter grade on each post article that basically reflects what it is and where it comes from and the validity of it and so on and so on?
Hmm. I don't know about a letter grade. I mean, I think there are some groups that are doing that, and so they tend to be followed by people who think like them, and maybe that is possible. I think what I'd like to see is some kind of drop down box that you could click on the side of an article that would give you a sense of who the reporter was. And before, this was not important, and we tried to hide. A lot of us never wanted to be like part of the story, and it wouldn't really make you part of the story, but it would give you a way to contrast a reporter who's just gotten on the beat
Right.
or a reporter who's been in Washington for 20 years, Or it's on the same hand, one of the Breitbart reporters, to just pick one out of the air, who has never been a reporter before, and yet they're trying to be a White House reporter. You know, I keep thinking about my neighbor out in the farm where I live in this red place, and a lot of people out there who are nice people and and smart people, they believe other types of media like Epic Times, which is just so full of shit. It's just such a sorry, but it's not really a news outlet. And I keep saying, well, why does this person believe that? And thinking about ways to open up their minds. And I'm so part of what I've thought is maybe if you gave out the credentials, made it a lot easier to get the credentials of the people you're reading, that it would have some impact. I don't know if anyone has has an idea out there,
But
because I do think we are the story in a way that we don't want to be, but the right wing in particular, they are a big story, and we should go and figure out a way to deconstruct who they are, how they came, why they're doing what they're doing. A lot of people who did the fake news sites during the 2016 election were just there to make money. My favorite example are those Macedonian teenagers that we interview in our film. And they said, well, anything with Donald Trump in it gets a lot of clicks. So they were creating fake news sites that look like American news sites that were all about the latest crazy thing. The Pope endorses Donald Trump for president, stuff like that. And they could get so many clicks, so they could get advertisers, and they could make a lot of money out of it. So a lot of people are just there for that.
I like that idea of looking at the journalist as being the kind of source of the information. And if we want more background information, we can access it. Just like when I go to the grocery store, I'm waiting
Yeah,
for this app to come up on my
that's cool.
phone that allows me to scan, an apple, and I can see that it was grown, in whatever orchard in whatever place.
You
And I
can.
don't always have to access that information, but as a consumer who's trying to be as conscious as possible in a time when it's super hard to do so, I want that information because it helps me make my decisions more
Well,
properly.
maybe a who's it app for journalists,
Yeah,
where you can put your phone on the byline. Oh, that's clever. Yeah.
I think it's an idea.
I'm
Well,
gonna
Dana,
do
I'm going to ask you about the future and where we go for JUF 2021, but I'm going to play in the interim a very short clip from one of our students. This is
Oh, cool.
from Capitol High School, which is on Santa Fe's south side, and her name is Kimberly. And here it is, and I'll be right back.
Okay.
Ah,
Everyone. My name is Kimberly. I'm a freshman at Capitol High School located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My education has been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Before all of this, I was able to go to class, see my friends, interact with teachers, and have a hands-on learning. Now it's even a struggle to even ask a question. Technology isn't perfect. And something little that wasn't a big deal before in class has become a huge deal in with online learning. My family is from Guatemala. In Guatemala, student has to pay fees to go to school. They don't provide food, and there's even 75 students in a single classroom. And many aren't able to graduate from high school. I try to be grateful for what I do have. Yes, my education has been disrupted, but at least I still have opportunities to attend online classes. My favorite class in school is Principles of Biomedical Science. It's hard, especially learning online. But even though it's hard to learn online, I'm grateful because I have more opportunities than my family has ever had. I want to be the first person in my family to graduate from college. I want to be a chemist. I want to discover new drugs that can help cure people. I'm telling you my story because maybe it can help other students like me cope with digital learning and be grateful for what we do have. Digital learning is hard, but I'm so grateful for the opportunities I do have.
And there we have that was Kimberly. Thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, and we asked, we always ask our students to say something about, the conference theme. This year, we felt like they probably didn't have a lot to say about covering crisis, but obviously they're covering the crisis of their life right now, which is really dealing with the pandemic. And we've had some really nice responses from students. And boy, I miss that part of the in person of just having, a good crowd of young folks who are really absorbing and interacting with the information in different ways than you or I might. And that's anyway, we'll get back to that, I have no doubt. So when we come back in a year, we have reserved the Santa Fe Community Convention Center, which is where we had the first one, for November 17th, 18th, 19th, something like that. What are we looking at? What's our theme? What are we, there's so much to choose from. And I mean, I guess part of what is the theme is also, who are the journalists that we should invite and what kinds of conversations do we want to have?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of ideas, but we could talk about uh, climate change.
Mhm.
We could talk about covering. I think part of the problem with writing about climate change is the predictability of what it is, the predictability of the stories. Uh, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are doing amazing things. And I think the technology that is used to do the digital forensics, there's a technology that we probably aren't uh, quite using yet that can help us cover climate change in a different way. And also locally, not just nationally as a policy, but locally. That would be one of the things that I would at least think about for next year.
Yep.
Then you get a whole different group of people. Uh, I went to a workshop in Lausanne, Switzerland 2 years ago. It was the Federation of Science Journalists. And, just a completely different crowd. And it was very inspiring because people obviously know what they're doing if they're there. And I just think that would be, you'd get a lot of different kinds of journalists than you've had.
Mhm.
Concentrating on students might be interesting.
Yep.
Um, Especially, or having Native American issues more prominently, or indigenous people issues, which is something you and I have talked about.
Mhm.
That would bring an international flavor. But I hope that some of your participants are talking about what they'd like to see.
Me too. I've had 3 ideas sent to me. I think they're
Okay.
all interesting in their own right. One is um, religious freedoms and have journalists weigh in on, how those are or are not respected or covered by journalists around the world. Another one is, and I don't think this one's viable, but is interesting, is looking at, young journalists, teenage journalists, and hearing from them about their reporting on the world. And I think that's certainly an aspect we could bring in.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's totally the focus of a 3-day conference. And maybe the best idea I've heard so far is from, again, from Vicki Huddleston, called Covering Conflict, where we bring in journalists who've been covering wars, covering terrorism, covering drug cartels, covering, all the different kinds of conflict there are out there. And that certainly sounds like an interesting box to open with lots to say.
Yeah. I mean, this could be a component of any conference, but solutions.
Hmm.
The solutions to the business model, finding people who are figuring out a way to make community journalism viable. And then there's a whole branch of solutions journalism,
Right.
which I'm not that familiar with, but I know that it's growing because people, for one thing, individual journalists get get burned out, always writing about terrible things, and so sometimes writing about the solutions can be actually interesting. And some really good journalists have gone into that field,
Yep.
uh, and more funders like to fund those types of things as well. So
We
that's
we do have an active network here, the Solutions Journalism Network. I know it's a national network, but the local chapter here is quite active and quite good and quite interesting. So yeah, that's another good idea. Lots to think about. We've got
Lots.
lots of
Yep.
discussions coming up, but Dana, let me just take a minute to say, boy, thank you so much for everything you've brought to this conference, from your incredible moderating skills to these fun sessions where you and I get to chat, to Dana deserves every credit in the world for getting Bob Woodward to come on last night. So, thank you so much. We all have benefited enormously from your insights and enthusiasm
Well,
and questions.
it's a great forum. You do a great job. And I wouldn't be here for the third year unless it was totally fun for me. So I really appreciate it. And hopefully next year we'll see each other in person.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Good luck with the story, and I'm sure you've got lots of last minute edits to do.
Oh yeah. They're
I'm
lining up.
I'm gonna roll right now a piece of music. I should have rolled last night, but my mind was fried from all that high octane discussion. So this is Eliza Gilkyson performing one of her amazing songs. She's of course a big singer songwriter. Spent a lot of her career in Austin, but now lives not far away from where I'm sitting right now, down in Arroyo Seco, just north of Taos. So here is Eliza Gilkyson.
As I journey through my life in wonder, I'm struck by your beauty divine. With your blue seas and skies, a feast for my eyes, and your fragrance of sagebrush and pine. I have loved you since I can remember. Your water is my holy wine. I'll be faithful and true, for I pledge my life to this beautiful world of mine. Oh, beautiful world, dressed up in your colors so fine. I promise to share and handle with care this beautiful world of mine. How I love the unfolding of seasons. Your mountains all covered with snow, and your flowers in spring. Like a bird I will sing to the sunset and the hills all aglow. And in summer your gardens of plenty, and the fruit from your orchard and vine, and your bounty in fall. Oh, I love it all in this beautiful world of mine. Oh, beautiful world, dressed up in your colors so fine. I promise to share and handle with care this beautiful world of mine. Yes, I'm yours till the end, when love's rainbow will bend o'er this beautiful world of mine.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you. So talented, so good. She has so many great songs. Um, well, I guess that officially takes us to a point I didn't think we'd get to, which is the end. What a journey it's been. Let me give a few other shout outs. to my staff at CIR, to Takara Lake for everything she's done with our students, and she was busily monitoring the Q&A box to ward off any potential nonsense airs in there. To Shelley Winship, our director of development, for doing the incredible lift on the back end of getting all the tickets and all the reminders and all the calendar buttons and so on running properly. No small amount of work. To Susan J, our office manager, for attending to a billion small details to ensure that this program ran effectively. I have to thank my neighbors whose house I'm sitting in right now, a lovely couple from Dallas who are not here very often, and I have a complete and utter TV studio set up in their house, and I could not have done this sitting at home with my children and their pandemic needs right now. And and of course to my board of directors and to our board president Chuck Case for just being incredible supports and allowing us to experiment and figure out this crazy digital world that we're in and see how we can have the kinds of conversations we all know we love and need to have in this new format. And my last thanks goes to all the folks that have dialed in. We've had, I don't even know how many people have come in. We'll be sending out all this information, but thanks to you for taking the time. I know that staring at the screen for another session on something is often not what we often want to do, but thank you for dialing in. Thank you for your support. I've had so many kind words from folks all across the world, honestly, for this conference, and I'm really grateful you took the time to write. And I hope you'll join us again next year when the crazy adventure continues. So thanks once again, Dana. Best of luck, and we will see you all soon.